me any because I don't go to town anyway. So after about a week of that good job I had, why, he come and he said, I don't see you gambling any. Do you have any money? And I said, yeah, I have a little. And he said, well, whenever I make any money gambling, I send it home to my wife, and I'm broke now. Would you loan me $10? And I said, sure. So I give him $10, and 2 or 3 days he give me back my $10, and that happened about every month or so. Why, he'd run out of money and take a little bit and always pay it back, but that made it possible so that I had a good job, and whenever there was an inspection coming on, why, he'd always say, well, you gold bricks better get out of town. He says, get out in the woods and hide yourself. Don't be around here because they're going to inspect the company, and if you're here, you'll be inspected. Just lock your tent and get out in the woods and get out of the way so nobody where you are. So that went on, so I never did have to do any drilling or anything after that. I was just treated fine, and I was sure appreciative of that top sergeant. He was always very kind and considerate, and I was always ready to help him whenever he needed any help or anything. So that was really my Army experience.
Can you tell us when you heard that the war was over and the feeling of the...
Well, yes, on, I think it was November 1918, when was it?
November 11th, 1918, that's right.
1918?
Yep.
Well, anyway, the armistice on, and everybody went to town celebrating and getting drunk and everything, but we didn't go to town. The 4 of us, we stayed there and had a good time, but it wasn't very long after that. Why, I saw Alvin, and he says, I'm going to go home. I've got some letters that they've sent me that they need me home, and so he said, I've got a chance to be, what do you call it?
Discharged.
Discharged. And I said, well, I understand that we're going to be discharged before long too, so in the winter time, why, I was discharged and sent to Denver, Colorado, and was discharged out of one of the big bases there, Denver, Colorado, and I went from there to Salt Lake and on home on the railroad. So it was wonderful to be back home again and know that you got home safe. Other of the boys of the Virgin Valley all got home safe too, so that we felt very good.
Very good. Lee, why don't you just tell us something about, were you shortly out of high school, or how old were you when the Second World War started? And why don't you tell us just where you were and so on?
Well, I guess you could say the war started in December 7th, 1941.
What were you doing then? What, do you remember that event?
Yes, I remember that day very well.
How did you hear about it?
Well, I was living in Las Vegas, working in Las Vegas and living, and Vaughn Levitt, my cousin, and I, it was a Sunday, as you well know, and we decided to go to Overton and visit my folks and go to church there, and we heard it on Vaughn's radio. We was in the car. I don't know where we were or what we was doing, but I remember driving right up to it was in the evening, as I remember, and right up to the farm there in Overton, and before we got out of the car we had the radio on, and it was telling about the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and we knew that the war had now started and that we would be in it. Before that time it had been rumors of war for a long time. England had been in the war. You know, that Germany was capturing their neighbors, and England was in the war. But I was out of school for 6 months when that, well, 4 months when the war broke out.
And then you joined, why did you decide to join the Marine Corps instead of the Army or
Well, you were up to Reno when you decided
yes,
to go, weren't you?
right. There was That's right. I went to school in Reno at the university, and well, but all I knew about the war was in the newsreels. That was before television, and we had newsreels in the picture show houses, and it showed the war, and of course I read the newspaper articles, and it appeared to me that if I didn't hurry and get in the war, I was going to miss my war. Well, I soon repented of that, but as a matter of fact, I remember coming to an understanding of my predicament about, well, I joined the service in, well, I was in Reno, and I went down to the Marine recruiting office and volunteered, and then went back and forth to San Francisco on weekends for a few weeks getting lined up, and I guess that would have been in 1942, and
Let's stop for just a second.
we need to turn the speaker off.
Okay, we're underway again.
We're back in the war
We're
again.
back in the war again, you bet.
Well, what I was telling you about my great fear after seeing the newsreels, and of course they were very selective in what they show to excite the blood of the young boys and get the spirits of America geared up to fight a full-fledged war. But I'd gone into the Marine Corps and gone through training, gone to overseas to Australia, and was heading north up into New Guinea on a little old ship with a hull about 1/4 of an inch thick, and every time we'd hit a wave, well, the bow would bend in 2 or 3 inches, and I was about 2 holes down and right in the front of that bow, and nothing between me and torpedoes, but about 1/4 of an inch sheet of metal. But one of my friends had a big map of the world, and so we started looking at our situation, and it became very obvious to me that I could have waited several years before I needed to get excited about getting in the war before it was over, because we found where we were down at Australia and where the Japanese were, and my fears were completely gone about not being able to get any amount of war, because all I could see was hundreds of islands that Japan had taken, and we had taken Guadalcanal, and that's all. We had taken one island down and just off the coast of New Guinea and Australia. so I didn't. That was not one of my worries.
So you ended up being in which of the battles?
Well, like I say, the Battle of Guadalcanal was just over, and I joined the 1st Marine Division that had taken Guadalcanal, and I joined them and retrained with them in Melbourne, Australia, and then we come back up to New Guinea, and we didn't actually get in any battles in New Guinea. We trained there. We were bombed several times, but did not do any actual fighting on New Guinea. And then went across the Straits and to New Britain. And most people don't know these islands or where they are or what they are, but the significant thing about New Britain was on the northern end of it was the great Japanese naval base and air base of Rabaul, and we took what they called Cape Gloucester, the southern end of it, and that was a hard, tough battle. We was there during the rainy season, and mosquito-infested swampland, and I'll tell you, that was a tough battle. And then we fought at the Battle of Peleliu, which Marine Corps historians designate as the toughest battle of the Pacific. I think the reason more emphasis was not given on it. Is that for me?
No, it's okay. Somebody's coming on by to pick up something.
The reason I think that there's not more publicity, and nobody's looking for publicity, but the Battle of Peleliu is a strange thing. The reason for the taking of the island was for the launching of the attack on the Philippines. Peleliu sits off to the east of the Philippines, and that was to be one of their big bombing bases for the Philippines. Well, to show you, now we switched back and forth from the Navy command to the Army. We were on some islands, we fought under the Army, under MacArthur, and some we went back under Nimitz, under the Navy. And I don't remember who we was under when we was on Peleliu, but while we was on the way to Peleliu and about 2 or 3 days out, would you believe we heard on the radio that the Philippines were being invaded? So that was a big air base, and for the Japanese, we took the island, a very fierce, deadly battle. But it was not the big battle or the big airport for the invasion of the Philippines, but so the importance of the thing really didn't amount to much. It kept Japanese from bombing the Philippines from there, but that was a little different thing. That was a hard battle. I don't want to get into it in detail, but to give you an idea of the casualties, we went in there, and my company was 280. It's slightly under 300, what we call a reinforced company. And we were reinforced one time with new men that had been taken out and put in a pioneer company. Probably 20 or 30 men were brought back, but after 2 weeks of fighting, there was 21 of us that were there. Now, they weren't all killed by any manner of means, but they'd either been wounded or killed, and there was 21 of us left, so you can see what kind of a knockdown, drag out it was. And then I was in the Battle of Okinawa. Was in the first wave going ashore, and was there at the end of the war when the atom bomb was dropped on Japan, and in their surrender and the war being over. And then I was scheduled to be shipped home before the war was over because of my time overseas, the length of time and the number of battles and whatnot. Was ready to go, was scheduled to go home on a furlough, which was a bad decision for me, not to go home. I wanted to go home, but when anybody left a fighting regiment and were sent home on furlough, when you come back, you didn't come back to the same company. You didn't come back to the same division even. You were sent to Camp Pendleton, and they formed a new division. And so when you come back overseas, you either come back with a new one, or they just put you wherever they needed you. And that was a real difficult period because, see, I had 3 years experience. I was a platoon sergeant. I could do practically anything I wanted to do, and to leave that and come back into a new outfit, you see, was something that I worried about. And we were scheduled to go to Japan. We were then immediately in training for the invasion of Japan. We had all the maps of Japan, and they weren't telling us where exactly we were going, but we were contemplating in our staff meetings and in our training where we would go and what we would do and how we would contend with civilians. We expected the civilians to fight with pitchforks or whatever they had to fight with. And so I was in that position of having a chance to go home or a chance to stay when the war ended. Well, that immediately canceled all rotation home, and we were sent to North China to take the surrender of North China. And I was over there about 4 months in North China, and then when I went home, I was discharged. I mean, the war was over. And
now, had you any inclination that something like the atomic bomb was going to be used, or was coming, or in development?
Well, I'll tell you, for for about 2 or 3 months, well, from the time the Battle of Okinawa was over until the A-bomb, I forget now, but it was a month or two. There was a period of time there when we were, well, in regrouping, retraining, our wounded were coming back, and we were gearing up for the Japan. And we captured, oh gosh, about 4 big air bases, landing strips on Okinawa. And they were sending those B-29s from Okinawa to Japan, bombing them. I mean, that was the big value of Okinawa. The B-29s could bomb Japan from Okinawa. But those flyers were putting up any amount of money that the war would be over in a certain number of months. I don't remember what the months were. And of course, military people, they'll gamble on anything, you know. And there was a big exchange and a big to-do, and it was a real mystery to us how these flyboys could continually be spreading the rumor that the war was going to be over in 2 or 3 years. I mean, 2 or 3 months. They were betting that the war would be over, and we knew that we had years and years and years taking Japan. So, you want to turn that off?
Oh, go ahead, and I'll just talk to Dad here for a second. Dad, can you...
Let's just wait.
Oh, yes.
Good. We're interviewing my dad here.
Oh.
Come in. Come in. We'll interview you too. What can we do for you, Ron?
I was just wondering if I could borrow that nice tall jug of yours.
Oh, yes. No, I have, yeah, it's outside the
Enjoyed your remarks in our meeting, brother.
Thank you.
Very, very timely and very good. Appreciate you.
Thank you very much.
Good man.
Dad, can you tell us something about your mission, where you went, about your mission president and your assignment and so on? Go right ahead.
Before I went into the service, I had a call to go on a mission to the Central States. And after I got into the service, maybe 6 months or so, I got another call to go into the mission field, and it was also to the southern states, or to the central states. Both calls were to the central states. And then after I got home from my service, well, then I got a call to go to the southern states mission. And I had, it wasn't a patriarchal blessing, it was a blessing from Father's brother, Uncle Frank from Canada. He gave me a blessing once, I remember, and he promised me in this blessing that I would go on a mission and I'd go to the land of our fathers, where our fathers came from. And so I didn't know just exactly what the situation was. I was young and never didn't know very much about it. But when I got the call to go to the southern states, why, I went to Salt Lake City, and then from there to Chattanooga, Tennessee, was the headquarters to the Southern States Mission. And President Charles A. Callis was mission president, and he had been mission president for a number of years. And Eldman Levitt and I went to the same mission, and Sidney B. Sperry was in charge of our group to go to the Southern States Mission. We went to Chicago, and then we went from there to Chattanooga, Tennessee. And one morning, President Callis went around the room where the brethren were sitting and told each one of them where they'd go, to which mission in the southern states where they'd go. And when he got to my name on the list, he said, hesitated a little while, and he said, "Brother Earl, I think I'll just keep you in the office a few days and have you help us here, and then I'll tell you where you'll go later." So I thought it was kind of strange, but anyway, in about a week, I was there in the mission home, and we went tracting from the mission home and did things. And in about a week, one morning, why, he said, "Brother Earl, I think I'll have to send you to Ohio. I'll have to send you up there alone. There isn't anyone to go with you." And I had tears in my eyes, and he said, "Why have you got tears in your eyes?" He said, "Don't you want to go to Ohio?" And I said, "President Callis, that's the first time I knew that Ohio was in the Southern States Mission." I said, "I had a blessing from my uncle, and he told me that I'd go on a mission, I'd go to the land of our fathers." And he said, I said, "My grandparents came from Ohio. They lived in Scioto County in Ohio." And he said, "Well, that's all right." But I went to Cincinnati, and then later I was transferred to Portsmouth, Ohio, and in Portsmouth, Ohio, that was in Scioto County, and I had the opportunity of checking on a number of the Earls that were living there, but I couldn't find out any genealogy regarding our families because they didn't seem to be the same family of Father's family. And I wrote to Father, and we carried on a correspondence, but we could never find any of the same families that Father was from. But that's where that they left when they joined the church and went to Nauvoo, Illinois, with the prophet Joseph Smith, another, and then later Grandfather Earl was with the first company with President Brigham Young to come into the Salt Lake Valley. So that was my experience as far as the blessing was concerned in going to where Uncle Frank told me that I would go on a mission. And had I gone to either one of the other missions, I'd have been in the central states rather than in the southern states. And they called the Ohio the hospital of the Southern States Mission because of the climate, and many of the elders that got sick in different parts of the South, why they would send them to Ohio because it was a better climate. And then later Ohio was transferred to the Northern States Mission rather than the Southern.
How did you travel to your mission and back?
How did we travel?
Yeah, what connections did you make? And
oh, we went on the railroad then, every place.
But where did you go to Moapa to catch the train? Or?
Oh yes. We went to Moapa to catch the train, and we had a clergy ticket that gave you half price on all the passenger trains that you wanted to travel on. While you'd show your clergy ticket, and they would give you half price. A preacher was given privilege to travel cheaper than other people were. And lots of times, as young men, why, they'd question why you would have a clergy ticket at your age.
Why don't you tell us about your various callings in the church? After you got off your mission, you were then what, state clerk after a while? Or why don't you go through the various callings?
Well, after I got home from a mission, I was only home a few months when Irma and I got married, And before we got married, President Jones had come and asked me if I'd be state clerk of the Moapa Stake. So the first conference we had, we went to Bunkerville, and while we were there in Bunkerville, why, I was sustained as state clerk, and I know the Frainers came down to conference from Littlefield, and I had the chance of visiting with Irma a while during conference. And then when I was set apart as state clerk, why, President McKay was there, and he said, well, are you a high priest? And I said, no. And President McKay said, well, inasmuch as he's going to be taking minutes of the High Council and the stake presidency's meeting, I think that he should be sustained as, or ordained a high priest. So President McKay ordained me a high priest and set me apart as stake clerk, and I was voted upon in the conference to be ordained a high priest while I was there. And I was stake clerk for 18 years, and then after I was released from stake clerk.
You say President McKay set you apart?
Yes.
What, was he an apostle then?
President McKay was an apostle at that time, and he was down to conference.
Who was the president of the church then?
Who was president of the church at that time? I suppose President Grant was president of the church then. But anyway, then I was ordained, or set apart and ordained a bishop of the Overton Ward, and I was bishop of the Overton Ward about 6.5 years. And after that, why, then I was on the High Council for a few years. I know I was on the High Council when Lee had the ranch up at Overton, or up at Warm Springs, and I felt very bad because I had assignments to go different places on Sunday, and Lee was wrangling the cows and things, and then I was released as High Council, and I had the chance then to help a little bit more on Sunday with the dairy cows and a few things like that, to give Lee a little more chance to have the opportunity of going to church also on Sunday.
You were scoutmaster when Gary and Claire were scouts too, weren't you?
Yeah, I was scoutmaster for quite a long while, and while I was bishop, why, we had a good scout troop, and we did quite a little in scouting, and had the opportunity to go with the boys on different trips and things like that. Went to the Valley of Fire, and Ellick Swap was there in Overton, and he was one of the best cooks for campfire, and Ellick Swap would go with us on these scouting trips and learn the boys, or teach the boys, or show them how to do some camping and cook on a campfire, and I was always very appreciative of Brother Ellick Swap and his kindness to the boys. I know Roy Tobler was on the committee, and Clarence Johnson was on the committee, and some of the other men there in Overton were real good men to help the young boys in scouting, and we enjoyed it very much.
And then you're called to serve in the temple with Mother. What year was that?
Well, it was in 1955. President Bowler, I guess President Bowler asked Mother and I if we would go to St. George and be officiators in the St. George Temple.
And he was the stake president?
He was president of the Moapa Stake, and Bishop Shirtliff was bishop of the Overton Ward at that time. And it was quite a hard decision for me to see how we'd be able to make a living and go to the St. George Temple and spend 2 years. But as I said, you can't pray for the leadership of the church all your life and then turn down something when they ask you to do something. And my children all thought that Mother and I should go to the temple, and so we decided that we would, but I said that the only way we could go and that would be to sell the property, and the Overton Ward had been trying to buy the property anyway, because I said after the boys left I wouldn't farm alone. So the Overton Ward bought the property for the church welfare, and there's no need of keeping the home, so I wouldn't sell the farm unless we sold the home. So they bought the whole thing, and Earl and I went to Temple in 1955, and we were there 2 years, and when we got ready to leave, I said to President Snow, well, it's sure been a pleasure to work with you here in the Temple. And he said, well, you expect to come back this fall, don't you? And I said, no, we had to call for 2 years, and the 2 years are up. He said, yeah, but you forgot that the Temple was closed 8 months, so the 2 years. And I said, yeah, that's right. Well, he said, would you come back another year? And I said, yes, if you want us to, we'll come back another year. So we went back another year, so we were there in the Temple 3 years as officiators, and then we came back here to Las Vegas and lived with Lee when we left the Temple, and came back here in 1958. And we worked here I got a job in Vegas Village as one of the janitors, and I worked there for them for 2 years. And after 2 years, in 1960, President Snow called me on the phone and said, I'd like to come down and talk with you. And we were right here in this room where we're talking now, and President Snow and his wife came down, and he said, well, I've come down to see if you'll be a counselor in the Temple presidency. He said, do you and your wife want to talk about it a little bit? And Earl and I said, no, we don't need to talk about it. If you want us to come, well, we'll come. And he said, have you finished your Social Security? And I said, no, we haven't finished our Social Security. And he said, well, I hate to take you back away from that because you don't make any money working in the Temple. And I don't like to take you away from your Social Security. And he said, well, you know, I've been president of the Temple for 20 years, and I could be released tomorrow. And if I'm released, you'd be released. I said, I know church government too, President Snow, and I know the same people that ask you to take a job in the church, the same people have the authority to release you from a job in the church. But if you want us to come up to St. George again, well, we'd be glad to come. So we made arrangements, and President Snow went back, and he made arrangements with President McKay to be set apart, and Earl and I went up and stayed with Uncle Kenneth and Aunt Bertie. And we left one morning real early, President Snow and his wife and President MacArthur. And we went to Salt Lake, and we met President McKay, and he set me apart as a counselor to President Snow, and also set me apart as a sealer in the St. George Temple. And we went back that night, got there about midnight, and they didn't know in the St. George Temple who was going to be the other counselor. So that when we went back to the temple, they treated us very kind, and we worked in the St. George Temple with President Snow for 3 years as a counselor. And then when President Snow was released and President Atkin was put in as president of the temple, President Atkin asked President Boyk and I to be his counselors. And I was a counselor to President Atkin for 7 years. So in the St. George Temple, I was a counselor to 2 presidents for 10 years. And it was one of the happiest and most joyful experience of the life of Mother and I. We sure enjoyed it and have a lot of friends in St. George, and especially in temple work.
Good. Lee, why don't you tell us about your various callings in the church? I remember when you were up at the ranch, you were young men's president in the Overton Ward. Why don't you go from there?
I might reflect back when Dad was talking about our ancestry, the Earls coming from Ohio. When I was in the Marine Corps, I was in San Diego before I shipped overseas, and we was in a big mess hall there, and on the back of our jackets, the Marines there, we have our last name. And as I was walking out of the mess hall, I just happened to glance over, and there was a big, husky, broad-shouldered young man sitting there with Earl on his back, and so I had dropped out of the line I was in and kind of scooted over there and said, "Is your name, last name Earl? You know, sometimes you could make a mistake and put your first name." And he said, "Yes, it is." And I said, "Well, that's my name." And he said, "Where are you from?" I said, "Well, I'm from Nevada." And I said, "Where are you from?" And he said, "I'm from Ohio." I said, "Gosh, I'd like to talk to you." And I had to leave, and I never seen that boy again. But he was sure a nice-looking chap, big, husky, good-looking kid, and real nice personality. But like I say, I would have liked to have met him and got acquainted with him, but I didn't. Yes, I was back in the days when they had MIA superintendents, I think, and it was a kind of a hard situation. We lived 25 miles from the Overton ward up on the ranch, didn't even have a telephone, and but we made an honest stab at it, and had quite an exciting year. And then I was in the, we were transferred to the Logandale ward, and I was in the Logandale Sunday School presidency. And I think that was even superintendency then, but that was one of the good jobs, counselor in a Sunday school. Those days, I think, had a broader, much broader program than they have now, and function as a counselor, and that was a real good experience, good duty.
And who was the superintendent?
Kenneth Jensen was the superintendent. I worked with Wilford Whipple. Wilford Whipple was the other counselor, and I'll tell you, I sure learned to love those men. They were good, loyal men. I'll tell you, I loved them. It was very, very, very good experience. And then when I come to Las Vegas, my cousin Scott Hardy was the Elders Quorum president in our ward, and he asked me to be a counselor in the Elders Quorum presidency, and that was a good experience. And then I was made to 70, and I functioned in the 70s. Believe it or not, one of Dad's old chums, Eldon Levitt, was the 70s group leader, and he asked me to be in the 70s to function in genealogy, believe it or not. That was when each quorum, even then, we're trying to do the full spectrum of responsibility, and I wasn't called as a 70 to do missionary work, believe it or not. I was called as a 70 to help promote genealogy in the 70s quorum. And then I was called to help in the scouting program of the ward, you know, in the change of bishops and whatnot. I suppose I held some other positions along the way, but I don't remember exactly what it was, but I was some kind of a scouting coordinator, and got acquainted with the new bishop, and it wasn't long till he asked me to be a counselor. And so I served about 5 years as a counselor in the bishopric, and then I was asked to be a bishop. I was a bishop about 5 years. And I was on the High Council before I was made bishop. That's right. They released me as a counselor in the bishopric and put me on the High Council. And then I was made bishop. And then I was put back in the High Council again, and for a few years, and then I was served as a counselor to President Dixon in the state presidency. and that was a good experience. And I was released from there to, while I was counselor, they needed somebody to help with the welfare farms, and while I was a counselor in the presidency, the stake presidency, they assigned me to be responsible for the welfare farms in this area. And that work became so big, I asked to be released so I could devote full time to it. And after about 5 years, I was released from the welfare farm and now serving in the stake mission. Lived happily ever after.
Lee, could you tell us something about Grandma and Grandpa Frainer as you remember them? Or did you know Grandpa Frainer?
Yes, I was only 2 years old when looking at the genealogy sheets. 2.5 years old, I guess. I was born in January of 23, and Grandpa Frainer died, I think it was in the summer of 25, if I remember, by looking at the genealogy sheets. And the reason I keep looking is because I remember just as clear as when I got up this morning, seeing my grandfather at the foot of a wagon bed as my mother and I woke up one morning. Now, a lot of people would say a 2.5-year-old kid couldn't remember anything, but I don't remember when he died. Quite frankly, I do not remember his death. But he was a great watermelon raiser. He was come from Switzerland, and as a boy, and I don't suppose he learned it there, but he was a good farmer, wasn't he, Dad?
You bet.
And he raised grapes and fruit and melons. Even developed a special muskmelon called the Frainer melon that are still carry the name and the seed today. But my mother used to go back up there, I think a lot of it, not only to visit, but for fruit, putting up fruit and things like that, you know. And
grapes.
But I remember, you know, the old freighting wagons had a box with sides about 2 feet high. And whether this was an old one or a usable one, but in the summertime we all slept outside in those days because we had no coolers. And I don't remember Dad, whether he was there, apparently not, but my mother and I were sleeping in this wagon bed, had a mattress, I'm sure. Anyway, we were sleeping there, and I can remember Grandpa Frainer standing at the end of that wagon box as we woke up with a melon under each arm. Now, a lot of people would say, well, you just heard somebody tell that story, but I remember it. I remember it. And quite frankly, I did not see a picture of my grandfather until about 5 or 6 years ago. I didn't know there was even a picture existed of him. You probably, Gary, showed me the picture of him. But I'll tell you, it was the same man. The same kind of hat and moustache and the whole thing. But so that's really all I know, besides what my mother and father and Uncle Lou Adams has told me a lot about him. Probably Uncle Lou Adams and Dad have told me more about him than anything. But some of the humorous things I might mention, Uncle Lou Adams mentioned it and Dad verified it, but they said it didn't make any difference who was in charge of the music in the Littlefield ward. Grandpa Frainer always led the music. And I understand that, of course, Grandpa Frainer married one of the Reber girls, and his brother Albert Frainer married Grandma Frainer's sister. So 2 brothers married 2 sisters, and I understood they sang well, and they sang a lot of quartets. They were asked to go around
in
Various
Virgin
things.
Valley.
And sing. They apparently played the guitars and sang and yodeled and the whole thing. But another thing that Uncle Lou and Dad verified, told me about, was that when Grandpa Frainer would sit at the table, he had never sit up at the table to eat with his feet under the table. And believe it or not, why it's significant to me, I do the same thing. You sit sideways with your knees crossed and eat like this.
Interesting.
And do you remember that?
Oh, you bet.
And Uncle Lou and Dad have also said that he would not mix anything. Now, I'm completely different from that. I'll mix everything, and if I've got something I don't care for on the same plate as something you do care for, it's very easy for me to mix them together, and it's all tastes about the same.
You never gave Grandpa Frainer mashed potatoes. They had to be a potato just on the plate. No mashing it up with milk or butter or anything else in it. That was one of the things that he would not use, was mashed potatoes.
But, so these are kind of some of the things that I've heard secondhand. Dad could tell you about him, but I'll tell you, he sure had a reputation.
Better
Grandpa,
tell him how the cellar smelled.
Oh. Yeah, when I was a kid, Grandma and Grandpa Frainer had a rock house there in Littlefield, and of course, you know, you're as a kid, when you have pleasant memories, well, you know, they linger long with you. And they had this rock house, and there was under the shade of the cottonwood trees, and there was a ditch of water run down to the front of the, well, I guess it'd be the back of
the house.
But Grandma Frainer, when I was growing up, lived in the back of the house, and she rented out the front. And so we kind of just dealt in the back. And probably had a bedroom and a kitchen and then a cellar, and that's about all she used. And the rest of the house she rented out to school teachers or whoever. Well, I remember Uncle Lou and Aunt Lillian and their family lived in part of it at one time. But you go down in that cellar, and it was damp and moist and cool down there, and they had their big pans of milk sitting around where the cream could come to the top, and the hams and their dried fruit. The odor of that sweet cellar lingers in my mind to this day. You know, one of those delightful grandmothery things that happen, you know. But Uncle Joe Frainer was a big melon raiser, so the orchard and the grape vineyards and the melons continued right on after Grandpa Frainer died. Uncle Joe, he continued on, and I'll tell you, they raised good vegetables and good melons, and one of the significant things of my mother and all of them, and I'm a little bit the same way. I don't eat many watermelons today, but even when I do, if it's a real sweet one and a big one, I just can't bear to throw the seeds away. Any time you had a sweet melon and a good one, you just saved the seeds. And those are the seeds you planted. And if Mother was living today and you had a good, big, sweet, juicy tomato, our mother would save the seeds for that, knowing full well that we'd go to the store and buy plants, but she could never break the habit of it.
That's right.
And I'll tell you something, that's a real chore to save the seeds of a tomato. You got to wash them, you know, get the tomato scum off from them and dry them, and it's quite a trick to do that. But you just don't throw those kind of seeds away, you save them, and that's why you develop good melons and good tomatoes and those kind of things.
Why don't you recall for us what you remember about Grandma Frainer and her personality, disposition, and if our mother inherited some of those qualities? Or?
Well, Grandmother Frainer was a unique character in my life. She was built like a Rebber. She was short and stout, I think, the way you'd term it. She was quite large, and she wore her hair kind of combed straight back with combs. But she was a favorite. When she'd come and visit with us, I remember our bishop, Bishop Robinson, he just loved her. He just thought Sister Frainer was great. But she was I think you'd call her jolly, wasn't she?
Oh, one of the best.
She was just a jolly, loving person. And I remember when I was a kid growing up, with all the colds and sicknesses that kids get, you know, my mother, now she isn't here to defend herself, but it seemed to me like you starve, anytime you're sick you don't get to eat anything but castor oil, and you know, that wasn't any fun to be sick. And I remember when Grandma Frainer was there visiting, well, I remember her sticking up for me that said, Irma, you can't starve this kid to death, you know, no matter whether I was starving or not. She was my champion, you know, to see that we got something besides castor oil to eat. But she was one of these kind that just, well, a grandchild just couldn't do nothing but love Grandma Frainer now, because she was about as wide as she was tall, and that's an exaggeration, but I mean to tell you, it was all love. And boy, she just was a loving person, and just a outgoing, loving person. And I remember one time she was down there staying with us, and we had a good neighbor that was a good friend of Dad and his father, well, it was just kind of an accepted thing that we always raised melon patch and melons, and it was just an accepted thing that he would use melons. In other words, it wasn't, I mean, that was part of the program, that he was our good neighbor and he had used our melon patch. And anyway, we had some of these special Frainer melons. Now, if you haven't ever seen a Frainer melon, you don't know what you're talking about. They're maybe this gets big in the eyes of a kid too, but I remember Frainer melons being, gosh, some of them weigh 40, 50 pounds, wouldn't they?
They were large.
They were big, huge melons. You can't buy them like that, but it's all you could do, a kid, to carry one of them. And I remember we'd naturally, when they'd come on early, you know, well, you'd spot them, and so you'd get them just when they were just right, you know. And some of these melons got disappearing just about the time we was waiting for them to be ripe, and they'd turn up missing. And Grandma Frainer said one day, she said, well, she says, you just kind of want to watch your neighbors, and when they start putting on a little belly, well, you can tell who's getting your, you can tell who's getting your. Well, right away I knew who had the pot belly around the neighborhood, but that was Grandma Frainer, you know. It didn't make that, wasn't that big of a deal to Grandma Frainer. If you want them, go pick them before they get them. But she was just a delightful person to be around. She was just, and in her older years, she went to St. George and spent a lot of time in the temple. And it's like Grandmother Earl. She went to St. George and spent her last years just going to the temple every day, and Grandma Frainer did. I'm going to tell you,